My name is Eloise Tanner. I spent 31 years working the overnight shift at Mercy General, and I never once thought that the loneliest chapter of my life would also be the one that taught me the most. My husband passed in the spring, pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis to funeral was 11 weeks, which is not enough time to say everything you need to say to a person you've shared a bed with for 40 years. People kept telling me to take time for myself, to grieve, to rest. I tried that for about 6 weeks and nearly lost my mind, so I went back to work. I wasn't a nurse anymore. My knees had seen to that 2 years prior, but the hospital kept me on as a patient intake coordinator, which is a fancy way of saying I sat behind a desk from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, checked people in, verified insurance, and handed out clipboards. It was quiet work. I liked quiet by then. The problem was getting there. I'd never needed to think about it before. My husband drove me everywhere. 40 years of marriage, and I could count on one hand the number of times I took a taxi alone. After he passed, I got my license updated and bought a little used Civic. But night driving, I don't know. The highway at midnight started feeling like a different country. Too dark, too fast. I had one bad moment coming home in the rain where I couldn't see the lane markings, and I just sat in the parking lot of a Walgreens for 45 minutes until I felt safe enough to move. After that, I started using a car service. The app assigned me different drivers at first. Some were fine, some weren't. Then one Tuesday in October, a green Honda Accord pulled up, and the man inside said, "Good evening," and something about the way he said it, like he meant it, made me feel like a person again instead of a package. His name was Darnell. He was small things, smell of lavender, that I hated but small friendly, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead even when he wasn't reading anything. He drove the way careful people drive. Both hands, consistent speed, no sudden moves. I noticed that immediately. After weeks of white-knuckling it in my own car, riding with someone who drove like they had somewhere to be, and also intended to get there safely, was an enormous relief. I didn't say much that first night, just thank you and good night. But the next week, he was assigned to me again, and the week after that. It wasn't a coincidence exactly. I'd started specifically requesting him through the app. There was a way to do it, a preference setting, and I figured out how after the third or fourth ride. I don't know if he knew or not. He never mentioned it. What I did, starting maybe the third week, was bring him coffee. I know that's a small thing, but I worked in a hospital. I knew what it meant to be up all night, to have someone hand you something warm without being asked. I bring a thermos from home, just regular drip, the kind I made for myself. And when I got in the car, I'd set it in the center console cuff holder with a little post-it on it that said his name. The first time I did it, he looked at it for a second and then looked at me in the rearview mirror and said, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "I know." That was the beginning of a conversation that lasted, in pieces, across many months. I learned that Darnell had driven for the car service for about 4 years, after a long career doing deliveries for a warehouse company that had automated most of its routes and let a large portion of its workforce go. He wasn't bitter about it the way some people are bitter. He talked about it plainly, like it was weather that had passed. He'd adapted. He drove nights because the traffic was lighter and because daytime hours were when he ran errands for his mother, who was in her 80s and still living alone in the house where he grew up in Decatur. He had a son. He didn't bring it up easily, the way you bring up something you're proud of. He brought it up the way you bring up something that costs you something every time you say it. His son was 26, lived in Phoenix, and they hadn't spoken in almost 3 years. He said it once and then didn't say more. I didn't push. I also didn't ask about his wife, because something about the way he carried himself told me that was another door I should wait to be invited through. What I did when he dropped me off each morning was say something like, "Drive safe, get some sleep, your mother is lucky to have you." Small things, true things. He'd nod, Sometimes he'd say, "Same to you, Miss Eloise." I liked that he remembered my name. The months moved the way months do in grief, not smoothly, but in patches. Some weeks I was fine. Some weeks getting out of bed felt like a construction project. October became November. November became December, and December was hard because my husband had loved Christmas in an embarrassing, wholeheartedly unironic way, and the house felt like a museum to that. I kept working. I kept my Thursday nights with Darnell on my way in, and my Friday mornings with Darnell on my way home. Sometimes I'd catch myself looking forward to the ride in a way I hadn't expected. One Friday in late January, something was different. He picked me up at the usual time, 6:15 in the morning. I got in, said good morning, set the coffee in the cuff holder. He said good morning back, but he didn't say it the way he normally did. His eyes in the rearview mirror were not on the road, the way they usually were. He kept looking at me, then away, then back. We were about 10 minutes into the drive when he passed my exit, not slightly, not like he was distracted. He passed it deliberately and kept going. My stomach dropped in a way I hadn't felt since those first weeks after my husband died. I said, "Darnell." That was my exit. He said, "I know." He said it quietly. And then he said, "Miss Eloise, I need you to bear with me for a minute. There is something I have to tell you, and I'm going to need you to just listen before you react." I looked at the back of his head. I thought, 63 years old, and I am in a car on the highway at 6 in the morning with a man who just passed my exit. And then I thought, this is Darnell. I know this man. Not completely, but enough, I said. "All right, I'm listening." He said that for the past several weeks he had noticed a car parked on my street when he dropped me off. A silver Chevy Malibu, always in the same spot, 2 houses down from mine. He said the first few times he thought nothing of it. Lot of people park on residential streets. But after a few weeks he started paying attention. The car was always there when he dropped me off between 6 and 6:30 in the morning. Always the same spot. And it wasn't registered to anyone on my block. He knew that because he'd started noting the plates. I said, "You ran the plates?" He said, "No, ma'am." He said his nephew worked for the county and had done him a favour, and that he knew that was probably overstepping, and he was sorry, but something had felt wrong and he hadn't known what else to do. I asked him what name came up. He said the car was registered to a man named Gerald Foss. I didn't recognise that name at first, then I did. Gerald Foss had filed a complaint against me 14 months earlier through the hospital's patient services department. His mother had come through our intake on a night I was working, during a busy stretch when we were short-staffed, and he'd claimed she had waited an unreasonable amount of time and that I had been dismissive when he called to check on her status. The complaint had been reviewed and closed. I'd submitted my account. My supervisor had submitted hers. The timestamps didn't support his version of events. He'd called the department twice more after that, spoken to my supervisor's supervisor, and been told each time that the matter was resolved. I had put it out of my mind. Apparently, Gerald Foss had not. Darnell drove me to a Waffle House about 3 miles past my usual exit and pulled into the parking lot. He put the car in park. He turned around to look at me directly for the first time. He said, "I don't want to scare you more than necessary, but I also couldn't keep dropping you off there and saying nothing." I sat with that for a moment. The Waffle House windows were lit up yellow. A couple of truckers were inside at the counter. Normal life, happening 20 feet away. I asked him how long he'd been watching this. He said about 5 weeks. 5 weeks. He'd been watching out for me quietly, without saying anything, for 5 weeks. Because he hadn't wanted to frighten me, and he hadn't been sure enough until recently, and he'd been trying to figure out the right thing to do. I thought about my husband, and how he used to say that good people don't announce themselves. I asked Darnell what he thought I should do. He said he thought I should call someone, family, A friend, someone who could stay with me or let me stay with him for a few days while I figured out next steps. He said he thought I should file a report with the police, even if nothing had technically happened yet, just to have it on record. He said he'd already written down the plate number, the dates and times he'd observed the vehicle, and a description of the car, and he handed me a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket. That piece of paper. Neat handwriting. Dates going back 5 weeks. I have a daughter who lives 40 minutes away in Roswell. We talk on Sundays and sometimes Wednesdays. She calls me Mama even though she's 41 years old, and I have always loved that. I called her from the Waffle House parking lot at 6:40 in the morning, and when she answered, I could tell I'd woken her up, and I just said, "I need to come stay with you for a little while." She didn't ask why. She just said, "I'll put the coffee on." Darnell drove me to my daughter's house. On the way, I called the non-emergency police line and started the process of filing a report. The officer I spoke with took the information, pulled up Gerald Foss in their system, and told me that this was not the first time his name had come up in a harassment context. He had a prior incident on record involving a dispute with a former employer that had escalated to the point of a restraining order. Something moved through me that I can only describe as delayed fear, the kind that comes after the danger has been identified, when your body finally decides it's safe to react. When we arrived at my daughter's street, Darnell put the car in park and turned off the meter. I asked what I owed him, and he shook his head. I said, "Darnell, that's not right, you drove out of your way." He said, "Miss Eloise, you have handed me coffee on 40-something Friday mornings. We are more than square." I started crying. Not dramatically, just the kind of tears that happen when something holds for a long time and then gets to let go. I stayed with my daughter for 8 days. During that time, the police made contact with Gerald Foss. He had not broken any laws yet. Technically, parking on a public street is not illegal. But the documentation Darnell had kept, combined with the prior incident report, was enough to support a formal warning. His employer was also notified, which I understand had significant professional consequences for him. My hospital's security team was alerted. I was offered an escort to and from my car for any shift I chose. Gerald Foss's car has not appeared on my street since. I tell you that because I want you to know the story has an ending. Not a dramatic one, not a courtroom scene. Just a slow disappearance, which is sometimes the best kind of ending. On my second day at my daughter's house, I called Darnell to thank him properly. He answered on the 3rd ring. I said what I needed to say, and when I was done there was a pause, and then he said, "Can I tell you something?" He said that the morning he'd finally decided to say something, he'd almost talked himself out of it twice. He'd thought, maybe it's nothing. He'd thought, it's not my business. He'd thought, what if she thinks I'm overstepping and reports me to the app? He said what made him finally say something was a memory of his son. He said that 3 years ago, when they had their falling out, the thing his son had said, the one line that had stayed with him was, "You never say anything. You see something wrong and you never say anything." He said he'd been thinking about that for 3 years, about all the times he'd seen something and stayed quiet because it felt safer or smaller or not his place. He said he had made a decision sometime last year that he was going to stop doing that, not in a big way, just in the small ways that add up. I asked him if he'd talked to his son since. He said not yet. I asked if he wanted to. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said more than just about anything. I said, "Darnell, your son told you who he needed you to be, and then you went ahead and became that person. That's not nothing, that's actually everything. I don't know what he did with that. I only know what I did. I have a friend, a woman I've known since our children were in elementary school together, whose husband had passed 2 years before mine. She mentioned her son to me in the same careful, pained way a few months back. Estrangement, something about money and words said during a hard time that never got unsaid. I called her that afternoon. I told her about Darnell, not the whole story, just the part about his son. I said, sometimes people are waiting for someone to tell them that enough time has passed, that the person they've become is enough. She was quiet on the line for a moment. Then she said, I've been thinking about calling him for months. I said, so call him. She did, that same week. I'm not going to tell you it fixed everything in one phone call because that's not how estrangements work. But they talked for an hour and a half. And then they talked again the following Sunday. She texted me afterwards, and the only thing she said was, thank you. Spring came the way it always does. Slowly and then all at once. I went back to driving myself to work on the evening shifts, though I still requested Darnell on the overnights through the winter. When the weather stayed light longer and I felt steadier, I started doing the full drive on my own again. The last time Darnell drove me home, I brought him coffee as usual, and I also brought him a card. Inside I'd written only, I hope you make the call. He texted me 3 weeks later. It was a short text. It just said, we talked. Thank you, Miss Eloise. I sat with my phone in my lap and I thought about my husband and about all the years I'd spent in that hospital, checking people in at their worst moments, handing them clipboards, asking for their insurance cards, and how I'd always tried to say their names correctly and look them in the eye while I did it, because I knew that sometimes that was the only kindness they'd get that night. I used to wonder if it mattered, something that small. I don't wonder anymore. Be kind to people. Not because they will save your life, though sometimes they will. Be kind because you cannot know what someone is carrying, or what they're watching, or what memory they're trying to finally outrun. A cup of coffee on a cold Friday morning is not a grand gesture. It's just a way of saying, I see you. You're not invisible to me. Sometimes that is the whole thing. Sometimes that is absolutely everything. I have thought a lot about the word ordinary since all of this happened. We use it like it means small. Like ordinary things don't count toward anything. I spent most of my life doing ordinary things, showing up to a desk at 10 o'clock at night, asking people for their insurance cards, saying their names correctly so they didn't feel like a number. I used to wonder sometimes if any of it added up to something, or if I was just filling in a form that someone else would file and forget. What I know now is that ordinary things are the whole structure. They are the load-bearing walls. You don't notice them until something tries to knock the house down. Darnell was an ordinary man doing an ordinary job. He drove careful. He said good evening like he meant it, and for 5 weeks he wrote down dates and times and a license plate number on a folded piece of paper he kept in his shirt pocket, because he had decided, quietly and without telling anyone, that he was going to stop staying silent when something felt wrong. That decision didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of regret about his son, about all the times he'd seen something and chosen the easier road of not saying anything. He had been paying that cost privately for 3 years. What he did for me was the direct result of who that cost had made him. That is not luck. That is character, built slowly, out of consequence. And I think about what I brought to it, not the coffee. The coffee was just coffee. What I brought was consistency. I showed up the same way, week after week. I treated him like a person whose name mattered and whose long nights mattered. I didn't do it to earn anything. I did it because I had spent 31 years in a hospital watching people be invisible to each other, and I had made a decision early on that I wasn't going to participate in that. The return I got was not something I planned for. You cannot plan for it. You can only build the kind of record that makes it possible. That is what I mean when I say this story is about cause and effect, not coincidence. Courage is not the absence of hesitation. Darnell told me he almost talked himself out of saying something twice. He sat with the discomfort of not knowing if he was overstepping, of not being certain enough, of worrying about what I might think of him. He said something anyway, That is the actual definition of courage. Not the version where you feel no fear, but the version where you feel it and move forward because staying quiet has already cost you too much. Wisdom is knowing which silences are safe and which ones aren't. Darnell had learned that lesson the hard way, through his son, through years of distance that didn't have to be that long. He carried that knowledge into a Honda Accord on a cold January morning, and he used it. That is wisdom in practice, not a principle you hold, but a decision you make when it's inconvenient and uncertain and costs you something. And resilience, that one I had to find in myself. After my husband died, I could have stopped. I almost did, in ways that wouldn't show from the outside. Instead, I went back to work. I kept my routines. I made the coffee. I stayed in the world, even when the world felt like it had been reorganized without my permission. That is what kept me available for the moment when someone needed me to be findable. We talk about kindness like it's decoration, something you add when you have extra. I don't believe that anymore. I think kindness is infrastructure. It is the thing that holds the rest up. Take care of the people in your ordinary life. Pay attention. Say the names right. Leave the coffee in the cuff holder. You cannot know what it will build. But it builds something. I promise you that it builds something.